Howdy y'all, and welcome back to the Texian channel. This is episode 3, Income and Wealth Inequality. One's good, and one's dangerous. In my last video about Glass-Steagall, and I mentioned that Glass-Steagall brings out some pretty passionate responses in people when you ask them about it. But those passionate responses are limited to people who are in the banking industry and really understand what it is, or people like me who are interested in how we regulate the banks and keep an eye on that and monitor that, if you will. So if you stopped 1,000 people on the street and said, what do you think about Glass-Steagall? Might get 20 people maybe who would know what it is, much less have an opinion of it. But if you stop those same 1,000 people and say, well, what do you think about wealth inequality? You'll only probably get about 1,500 different answers, because this is something that people feel very strongly about, very passionately about, and rightly so. Now, the purpose of this channel is to have constructive conversations around these things. So I'm going to present what I think is a very fair view of this issue. But, as always, if you spot something here that is wrong, or that I haven't thought about the right way, or there's a different perspective I should consider, comment below, let me know. I want to improve my own understanding of these things too. And I hope that with that constructive commentary, we can move the debate from this into something that's a little bit more healthy. So let's get started. I think the first thing we need to do is clear up some confusion in terminology. We need to separate income and wealth because they're two different things. Income is, well, these are definitions from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, by the way, not mine. A gain or recurrent benefit usually measured in money that derives from capital or labor. That's your paycheck, right? You go into your company, you trade your time and your labor, they give you cash in return, and that cash comes to you either every 2 weeks or maybe twice a month, however you're compensated by your company. That's your income. Wealth, Merriam-Webster says, is an abundance of valuable material possessions or resources, but I hate that definition. I think wealth is the totality of what your income allows you to buy over time. So it's all of your assets. It's what your incomes have allowed you to invest in, the savings from your income, the things you bought with your income. That's what wealth is. And I think it's also important to note that while wealth is a pie, in the sense that there's only so much GDP at any given time, that pie grows as the economy grows. And that little piece of bigger pie, as it expands, goes to different people differently. Some get a little bit more of that new pie than others. And that's how you get wealth inequality. But too often I think these terms get used interchangeably or merged into one, called economic inequality. And I hate that, because economic inequality, in my opinion, is too broad a topic. There's so many different factors that can go into economic inequality. Where you live, just to start, is a big determinant in your chances to be equal with others, right? So I don't think economic inequality is a healthy way to look at it. I think the best way to look at it is wealth inequality. I think that's what gets people passionate. That's what people feel in their gut is wrong. They see other people owning assets, owning property, owning things that they can't ever hope to own. They never have a chance to own them. And you might say, well, that's envious. I don't think it is. I think people sense in their guts that what we're seeing is that normal people aren't able to live as comfortably as they were in the past, because a lot of this wealth is being concentrated in few. And other people, normal people, don't have the capital to keep pace. And I think that's what really drives the passion around this issue. So let's take a look at income first. I think one of the most important things we need to do when talking about income is separate the value of a person from their income. Now, I say there that it's a Marxist concept, and I don't mean that as a slur. I don't mean that as an attack. What I mean is, when Marx and Engels wrote the Manifesto in 1848 and Das Kapital in 1862, within their thinking was this concept that a person, based on what they did for a living, would fall into a certain class. And the definition of who they were was a function of their income, and more broadly their wealth, because again, wealth is a function of income over time. But it was that idea that came from Marxist thought. And so when I say it's a Marxist concept, that's what I mean. And it's deeply unhelpful because people aren't their income. Their income is just the value of their labor input into the finished good or service. It's not a measure of the person's value. It's not a measure of who they are. We see this issue quite a bit when it comes to the minimum wage. People, signs get held up that people are worth more than $7 an hour. You're right, people are priceless. Life and human beings are priceless. The $7 an hour is just their labor value, the input of their labor. That's all that is. It's not a measure of the person. I think the richest guy in the world right now is Elon Musk. If he decided to leave Tesla and go down to McDonald's and be a fry cook, McDonald's could not afford to pay him his Tesla compensation. Not because Elon Musk is suddenly lesser of a human being or less innovative or less intelligent. It's because he's a fry cook now. And the value of his labor input into the finished good, the Happy Meal or the value meal or whatever you want to call it, is only worth so much. And so he has to be compensated appropriately. His income has to reflect that. So I think we have to have that concept first. And having unequal incomes isn't necessarily a bad thing in capitalism because people are different. And they should be rewarded for being different. Some skills have a lot more value. You get more skills over time. The older you get, the longer you're in working, or the longer you're in the industry working, the more skills you're going to have. And you can leverage that for more income. Some finished goods are worth more than others. We just kind of talked about that, right? If I'm a fry cook, there's only so much I can make. But if I'm welding a satellite together, if I work for Boeing and I'm, wiring up a 747 or a 777, whatever it might be, well, that's a different labor input. And those are definitely two very different finished products. And people have different talents and levels of education and work ethics and knowledge. And all those things lead to discrepancies in income, and none of them are necessarily bad. Uniformity of income would disincentivize hard work and aspiration. If I'm working next to somebody on an assembly line and I'm working extra hours and my throughput is higher than them and yet we're compensated the same way, why should I work harder? What incentive do I have? And if I move up a level in the organization, presumably to a level that has more value to the finished good, more of a valuable labor input into the finished good or service, then I should be compensated for that. And if I don't get any extra money, why should I aspire to it? What's the point? Why would I take on the extra responsibility for no extra money? Doesn't make any sense. So having unequal incomes is a good thing in capitalism. But the same isn't true for wealth. Not necessarily. And I think this is where we kind of get into the meat of this conversation. Once again, we have to separate the value of the person from their wealth. Wealth is inherited a lot, and that reflects on past people, not on the people who currently have it. And again, different people in society have much more value than a trust fund kid from River Oaks or Preston Hollow. The garbage man and the plumber are worth way more to me than the guy that's, down at an investment bank making a financial transaction. I'm not going to have the same levels of wealth, obviously, but one I can do without and one I can't. One I really need. So the societal value of people is not necessarily a reflection of their wealth. Having wealth inequality can sometimes be explained in an innocuous way. And we talked about how wealth is a factor of income over time. So older people are going to have more wealth. That's just the way it is. They work longer. They have an opportunity to accumulate more income over time. They have more of an opportunity to invest that capital and get returns on it. That's that income, I should say, and get returns on it. They can buy more assets. Those assets appreciate over time. So, you can't really compare someone who's been working for 50 years to someone who's been working 5 days. Their wealth are going to be different just because one's older and has a lot more time to accumulate that wealth. Some people get lucky. They get on board early. They capitalize on something new. The Walmart billionaires of Bentonville is a great example. Early adopters of Bitcoin. Those guys got in early. They bought low. They invested low. And now the prices are very high. And they've benefited from that and good on them. That's helped their wealth out immensely. But it's really a function of the fact that they lived in Bentonville back when Walmart was getting started and got their money in early. Or they were really tech savvy back in the mid-2000s, or I guess probably later than that, in 2012, 2013, whatever it might have been, and saw Bitcoin as, something lucrative to go get. And they put their money in it, and now they're benefiting from that. Some people invest better and save more. Just like I said, people make different choices with their income, with their capital, what they want to do with it. And technology and globalization have impacted people differently. That can also explain wealth too. So, wealth inequality isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, too much of it should trouble everyone. It should trouble everyone on the left. It should trouble everyone on the right, on the center, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, old, young, black, white. It should trouble everybody because it has societal impacts, which I'll talk about. First thing I think is wealth inequality is growing. Now, this data comes from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. And what it's looking at there is the population of the United States divided into three different groups. The top 10%, the next 40% after that, so the top 50%, those two combined, then the bottom 50%. You can see in 1989 what their percentage was of the total wealth of the United States. 67%, 30%, and 3% respectively. But look what's happened by 2016. The top 10% have gone up to 77%, netting out an extra 10% of the wealth. 8% of which comes from the next 40% of families, and 2% from the bottom 50. Now, some people say, well, there's people moving in and out of the top 10%, and that's right. And that's why I chose this data in particular, because it's not accounting for someone moving from the next 40 up to the top 10, or from the top 10 down to the next 40, or from the bottom 50 up. It's just taking a snapshot of the entire, distribution of wealth amongst America. Top 10%, how much do they have? And they have 10% more. So this problem is getting worse. In fact, if you look at it over time, it's getting much worse more recently. It's really a function of the 2008 financial crisis, in my view. But since then, the problem's gotten a lot worse, and people sense it. People know it. The generational gap is growing too, and again, we talked about how wealth is kind of a function of income over time. So let's take a look at this data. This is also from the St. Louis Fed. In 1989, older families, meaning people that, were close to retirement or had grown children, had 7 times the amount of wealth of younger families. So these are 32-year-olds, 30-year-olds, whatever it might be, have a couple young kids just starting out. By 2016, those same two groups, so, the older group and the younger group, it's not the same people, right? A lot of those older families, they may have retired or unfortunately passed on. And some of those younger families are now older families or, kind of moving in that direction. Once again, we're just taking a snapshot here. So what that older group that in 1989 had 7 times the wealth now has 12 times the wealth of younger families. So the generation gap doesn't really explain this. Older people have far more than younger people today than they did back in 1989. It's really important to understand that. This issue is getting worse. It's not getting better. Now, wealth inequality impacts societal stability. And there's some evidence from history to prove what I mean. I want to stop right here for a second and revert back to the slide for just a moment. Now, I mentioned a little bit that demographics can certainly play into this. I'm not going to talk about disparities between racial groups. And that's not because I don't think that's important or that doesn't exist or anything like that. It's just that I'm trying to look at wealth inequality in totality. Now, the same data from the St. Louis Fed that I just cited, I took a look at it, and what it indicates is that African American and Hispanic families have a higher percentage of the nation's wealth than they did in the past. But there's still a massive gap between white families and African American and Hispanic Latino families. So we still have a problem there. But it's not going to be the focus of this conversation. I'm looking at it more broadly. Again, not trying to diminish that, not trying to ignore it. I'm just saying that we're looking at it from a societal perspective, from a 30,000-foot view. And if you want to see more of that data and really dive into the demographic differences, that St. Louis Fed data that I cited, I'll go back to it here so you can see, that, St. Louis data from their Open Vault blog is really, really good to look at. And I encourage you to check it out if you want to. All right, so let's move on again. Wealth inequality impacts societal stability, and there's evidence from history about that. Rome, as we know, got very, very unequal towards the end of around 400 AD when it collapsed. I like this quote. This is from a fellow with the last name of Duncan, who I've followed quite a bit. He's an expert on Roman history. As a result of annexation and conquest, those are my words, now his, you have wealth on an unprecedented scale coming into Rome, making the richest of the rich Romans wealthier. And all of this is being concentrated in the hands of the senatorial elite. At the same time, these wars of conquest are making the poor quite a bit poorer. As a result, you see the skyrocketing wealth inequality. Now, what he means by that is the legions were off conquering all this new land. Spain, the Holy Land, for example, and Carthage as well. And 300,000 pieces of gold were coming in to Rome as a result of that. All of this conquered land was yielding them benefit. That's why they did it. However, that land was being conquered mostly by the poor, by farmers, who were being drafted into the military and sent to these places. And without the farmers there to manage the land fell into disrepair, the farms failed, and were put up for sale. And who bought them? Those same senatorial elite, with all of the wealth that the soldiers had brought into Rome. So when those soldiers came back, or the people that were even living there, recognized that land and all of these assets were being concentrated in the hands of senatorial elite, while they were sending the people that were losing that wealth off to fight in a war. Another example, the rise of Marxism in the springtime of the peoples in 1848 in the mid-19th century. Paris Commune, thing like that. Now, it's important to note that when Marx was writing what he was writing, there was a serious problem of wealth inequality. In fact, I think workers were being abused back then quite significantly. I really don't think anybody disputes that. Marx was tapping into a real problem. I disagree with his solution, but I think the 20th century proves his solution is not a good one, but he was tapping into something. And we had revolutions all across Europe in the middle of the 19th century because of the thinking of Marx. Marxist thought found fertile ground because people recognized the problem. They recognized there was something wrong, and along came this book, along came this thinking that explained a way out, explained a solution. And naturally they gravitated towards it. Peasants Revolt of 1381, same thing. That was more about a tax, to be fair, but the reason that the peasants were so upset about it was because they were being squeezed dry. And at the same time, the wealthy people that they were working on their land for were living the high life. They owned everything. The peasants were being abused. And frankly, they revolted against it. That's what happens when inequality happens. And of course, the French Revolution of 1789. That's another great example of this. Once again, the Ancien Regime, as it was called, which is the king and his court and everybody that's around the power center, they were doing quite well, making a lot of money, while normal people were struggling to find bread. Normal people were, one bad harvest away from starvation, which happened several times in the late 18th century, So when we have these big gaps in wealth inequality, societies tend to destabilize. People don't like that. It's natural, I think, in human beings not to accept that outcome. And so they start looking for a solution. They start looking for other alternatives. They try to find a way to explain it or a way to right that wrong. And far too often, people like Pol Pot, Lenin, Robespierre, even to a certain extent Wat Tyler, take advantage of that. Take advantage of that outrage and manipulate the crowd for their own ends. So it's dangerous. Wealth inequality is something we need to be aware of. Second point, it's harder for families to form. And this makes perfect sense, right? If you're not doing well financially, you're less likely to get married. You're less likely to have children. Here's a wonderful study. Socioeconomically disadvantaged adults are less likely to form marital relationships, are more likely to have children outside of marriage, and have less stable relationships than their more advantaged counterparts. So what does that mean? Well, it means that adults who are struggling financially don't get married, still have kids, but they have those kids outside of marriage, which makes it more difficult to raise them in terms of how to support them financially during that process. And that destabilizes society. I'm a conservative. I've said that before. Conservatives should be worried about this. We believe that families are the bedrock of society. Families are the bedrock of a functioning country. Patriotic Americans, whether they're left, right, or center, should worry about this. I am. I think it's a very bad thing. Social cohesion. Kind of talked about it on the last slide. And the sense of community also diminishes. I love these two quotes. As inequality grows, there are more demands for redistribution of wealth and confiscation of fortunes. So what does that mean? That means that people, like I said earlier, recognize the ill, recognize the problem, and want to do something about it. Rather than kind of working side by side in peace, in harmony, there's tension. They want a more equitable distribution. They see others having a lot and them not as much, and they want to redress that. That hurts social cohesion. And it certainly hurts the sense of community too. Again, as conservatives, this is something we value. This is something we think is important to the future of the country, stability of the nation. Wealth inequality is a direct threat to that, in my opinion, and it's something that we should address. When people do not see themselves as part of the same moral community with a shared fate, they will not have the solidarity that is essential for building up social trust. I think that's a pretty deep quote when you think about it. They're not part of the same moral community with a shared fate. Moral community. They look at the wealthy as somehow of a different morality. They're amoral. And we don't have a shared fate. If the crops fail, going back to feudalism, the crops fail, I starve. You, on the other hand, are going to be just fine. Because whatever crop we do have, you're going to eat. That's the rule. We don't have a shared fate. Factories get sent overseas. Probably do another video on that too. When that happens, the guy that owned the factory, the guy that owns that asset and owns all that wealth is doing fine. He's taking advantage of slave labor in China. But the people who used to work at that factory, the community around him, well, they don't have a shared fate anymore, do they? We used to kind of intermingle a lot more than we did as well. Kids kind of went to the same schools, played on the same baseball teams, went to the same church, the same social group, same synagogue, whatever it might be. Wealth inequality's taken that away. They live in different neighborhoods, gated neighborhoods. Can't go in there. What does that mean? Well, that means that we're divided now. We're separated. There's not a sense of community. There's not a sense of a shared fate. There's not that solidarity, as Rothstein and Uslander put it. I think it's really important to understand that. And as conservatives, that's something that should bother us. As liberals, it should bother you. As a libertarian, it should bother you. Anybody that wants this society to be stable and grow and prosper should bother you. So what can we do about it? What can we do about reducing it? Well, I want to make the point that we can't completely eliminate wealth inequality, and we shouldn't try to. Again, that's kind of a Marxist idea. And again, that's not a slur. What I mean is, that's the concept, right? We're all going to be the same. We're all going to have the same income and the same amount of wealth. Everything's equal. And I think we saw in the 20th century that rarely happens that way. And in fact, ends in a lot of tears for the people involved in it. Some inequality, again, is just a function of basic demographics and personal preferences. And we want people to aspire and take risks in hopes of greater reward. And, if you don't have the ability to gain more wealth by doing that, why would you? We also want people to save and invest rather than just recklessly spend their money. If you recklessly spend your money on assets that depreciate, you're not going to grow your wealth. If you invest them, if you save them, you will. So if we don't have, if we have some sort of mechanism where we're, taking away the wealth that people who are making smart decisions make and give them to people who are making reckless decisions, well, what are we going to do? We're going to cause a lot more reckless decisions. Why should I make a smart decision if it's not going to benefit me? People are a function of incentives, and we have to understand that. So we can't completely reduce it. We can't completely eliminate it, I should say. And taxing the rich, I don't think, is an answer. This is something that I've seen some people put out there, but I've been around these guys a bunch. I know how they think. They have armies of tax accountants and lawyers. You know, the tax code is full of loopholes. And the reason why we never get it reformed is because these people don't want reform. They love it. It's how they protect their wealth. It's how they get to live in the gated community and you don't. It's how they manifest this separation, or how they keep it going anyway. So they're going to hide their wealth. They're going to find a way to do something with it. They can incorporate it. You know, for legal purposes, a corporation is a separate entity. So if they took their capital and put it into an incorporation behind a corporate veil, well, you know, by the tax, you can't really touch it if it's under the threshold, which of course they would do. Why would you have it over the threshold, right? They're always going to put it under the threshold and protect it. And they can move their wealth overseas as well. You know, Gerard Depardieu moved from France to Russia when they passed a really punitive tax. There's plenty of, banks in the Cayman Islands and in the Caribbean and other places where that wealth can go. In short, the rich are going to find a way to get around this and keep their wealth. This isn't the solution. My solution, and as I always say, it's just my opinion, and I welcome your feedbacks and comments on it, is that we need to focus on the monetary policy because I think that's what's really driving this. Wealth inequality was declining until the late 60s and early 70s. And then we see it tick up. If you look at the Gini coefficient, which is the measure of wealth inequality in America, around the world really, you can see this happen. And I think that's a direct result of what Nixon did in 1971, breaking the Bretton Woods Agreement and allowing the US dollar to float. We'll probably do another video on that at some point, but suffice it to say that the dollar became untethered from gold, and we could do whatever we wanted with it. And of course, what happens when you do that? Well, you create a bunch of extra liquidity, and as we've seen in the past couple of videos, that capital, that liquidity, that money is always going to seek yield. So it goes out into the market, and it drives up asset prices. And what happens when asset prices get driven up? People who own the assets get richer. And the people who don't own the assets find it harder to buy in. So they keep getting more and more rich, and the people who aren't struggle to buy the assets they need to catch up. And that exacerbates the divide. Now, I realize that changing the monetary policy will come at a cost. Nothing's free in this type of regulation. It's a trade-off, right? It's what we always do when we set public policy. If it was an easy, obvious answer, we would just do it. We wouldn't need politicians. We would just do it. But I think that the benefits outweigh the risks of doing this. Getting our monetary policy back under control such that we don't have this, crazy amount of printing of money that we're doing and have been doing since the 1970s is going to deprive these asset bubbles of the fuel that they need. Asset prices will reset. And what does that mean? Well, your stocks are going to go down. 401k is going to take a big hit. House price is going to go down big time. If you own a house, you're going to take a big hit out of this in the short term. Pretty much any asset that has been inflated by all this money printing will reset. But what's the function of that? Well, that means that people who have been deprived of the opportunity to buy those assets in the past will now have that opportunity. They can now buy into those assets. They can now get on that train. And the wealthy that have pulled so far away will be brought back down. That's my view. Now, I understand, again, there's passionate views about this, and many of you probably disagree. And if you do, I'd love to hear what you have to say. I'd love to hear how this could be looked at differently, or what I might have gotten wrong. So as I always say, comment below. And if you like this video, please give it a like. If you think it's a good debate or helps the debate, then share it with your friends. Send it to people who you think might value from this, who might want to comment on it as well, might have some thoughts that they can share with you about it. And if you're really so moved, subscribe to the channel. We're going to do a lot of videos like this in the future, in the hopes that we can have those conversations, we can foster that debate in a healthy way. As always, it is my honor and pleasure to talk to you. I greatly enjoy it every time. Until the next video, God bless.